Hello and welcome to Press TV's News Analysis. Coming to you from Tehran, I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, more than 1 week has passed since protesters have camped out near Wall Street in New York that demonstrators have renamed Liberty Square. Occupy Wall Street protesters identified themselves as the 99% that will no longer tolerate the greed and corruption of the 1%. There seems to be no turning back as demonstrators express their outrage at what they call the injustices of the U.S. economic system.
American police have arrested 80 people for taking part in a march through the streets of Lower Manhattan in New York City. The demonstrators have camped out near Wall Street since last Saturday as part of their protest movement named Occupy Wall Street. Protesters accuse police of using overly aggressive tactics against the demonstrators. They say police have liberally used pepper spray, as it appears to have happened in this internet footage. Protesters are trying to keep their campaign alive by posting videos and images to make up for what they call a virtual media blackout. They are mainly against what they call corporate greed on Wall Street. They say the U.S. financial system only benefits big companies and the super rich. However, some protesters believe that the idea to occupy the financial district has been inspired by recent uprisings in the Arab world. They say they're planning to use the revolutionary tactics that people use in countries like Tunisia and Egypt to restore democracy to America. With growing desperation over the ailing U.S. economy becoming crystal clear, it's anyone's guess what the protesters will be demanding in exchange for leaving Wall Street.
Well, I'd like to welcome my guest to the program from London, author and political commentator, Ms. Carol Gould. From Paris, financial journalist and broadcaster, Mr. Max Keiser. And from New York, journalist and activist, Ms. Anna Miller. Thank you all for being with us. I'd like to start off in Paris with Max. Max, let's look at the situation that's going on. First of all, are you surprised that Americans, although they're small in numbers still, but that they have taken to the streets in Wall Street, or at least sitting in, and actually trying to pressure the United States into some changes? How significant is this in general?
Well, it's definitely part of the global insurrection against banker occupation, which includes the Arab Spring and other countries. But these protesters don't have a very good focus in terms of what they want, what their demands are, because let's remember that New York is the center of the manufacture of weapons of mass financial destruction, and most of these protesters are benefiting from America's financial terrorism overseas. For example, if you look at the percentage of income that goes to food, in America it's still very low, 12%, as compared with the countries that America is terrorizing with its financial weapons of mass destruction, like in the Middle East, where the percentage of food would be 40% or higher of income. So I think America is a little early. We have to wait and see where gas is $7 or $8 a gallon and food prices are triple where they are now. And when they cut Americans off from their food stamps, then we'll see a proper uprising.
Okay, well, let's turn to New York, joined by Ms. Miller, Anna Miller. Now, you, from what I understand, were out on the streets in New York. Give us the latest on the environment, the atmosphere that you found, and what you see as the main demands of those people demonstrating.
I think that the media has been very critical of the protesters for not having demands. And I believe that protests happen when people really feel that they have nothing to lose. And it's not necessarily that there is a concrete set of an agenda or a set of demands or a list of reparations that we're facing, but we are looking for things like the end of the corporate takeover of politics, which has had so many social effects that we are all feeling, the end of predatory loans, which has had a huge effect on both the student debt crisis and the mortgage crisis in America. And these are very concrete things that we have felt, and you see the protesters who have taken what is now Liberty Plaza, and they're really the face of the social ramifications of corporate greed in America.
Okay, well, let me turn to London, get Ms. Gould on this. How significant do you see these demonstrations that are taking place? Do you think, as Max said, that it is part of the global outcry, or is it something different in the United States?
Well, looking at the pictures and seeing the turnout, it certainly isn't in any way as large or as influential as the Arab Spring or as the huge demonstrations that have been going on, for example, in Israel, which Press TV has covered very comprehensively over the past few months. There were millions of people out in Israel a few weeks ago. But that was a very well-organized, well-led protest, as have been the protests in the Middle East. Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, said very recently that he could foresee blood in the streets because of social unrest. I think that's a bit of an overstatement. I do understand some of the grievances of the groups that protested this weekend, but it's not going to get them anywhere. Because one of the things that I keep saying whenever I'm on these programs is that no movement can have any effect unless it has great leadership. Likewise, a nation cannot make any strides without great leadership. Franklin Roosevelt, who many on the right and Republicans and conservatives still think was too much to the left, however, did lead America out of a depression, because the interesting thing that he did was that he got Wall Street and the bankers to comply with the requests that he made to reduce their salaries, to raise taxes. And what I'd like to know is, where is the leadership of this movement that was protesting this weekend? And I didn't see the point of this kind of chaotic sitting here and sitting there in New York.
Okay.
And
well,
not really
let me
having
turn
a
back.
There is no leader. I'd love to know who the leader is.
All right, let me turn back to Paris and get Max Keiser
leadership
back in on this. Max, what's your take on all this? Is it just something that, as Carol said, there's no leadership, they're just sitting there and no organization, and basically she feels that this is not the way to do anything? Do the people at this point in time, those who perhaps get it as far as what you've called the economic blackmail that has taken place, do they have a choice other than going to the streets?
Well, in terms of leadership, it's kind of interesting because the organizers of Occupy Wall Street are Canadian. It's a Canadian magazine called Adbusters. And apparently Americans themselves are not interested in protesting against banks, but they are interested in supporting a Canadian magazine's interest in supporting an occupation or a publicity stunt on Wall Street to promote a Canadian magazine. So you don't hear this voice. Where do you have to go to find genuine American uprising against a genuine threat would be Madison, Wisconsin, and Governor Scott Walker, who is a very dangerous fellow in politics in America. And that's the kind of thing we need to see more of in the United States. Union participation and grassroots participation. And the goal of that was to get rid of Scott Walker, a regime change. What lacks on Occupy Wall Street is this regime change concept. They need to identify a single person and then say, we want that person to step down. I suggest Jamie Dimon. He's chairman of New York Fed. He's CEO of JP Morgan. He's a financial terrorist, clearly. No one doubts that. Focus on regime change. Stay there until Jamie Dimon steps down. That should be the focus of Occupy Wall Street.
Well, what about that, Ms. Miller? You are one of the activists, I understand, that have been out there. How likely is this occupation of Wall Street to continue and actually become more focused, as Max Keiser has said, perhaps focusing on one individual or one entity, one aspect of the many grievances that a lot of the demonstrators may have?
I think that Occupy Wall Street is something that we're figuring out as we go, as happens with so many regime changes and revolutions. I believe that there's a point with needing to find more focus, but I believe that there's a fine line between too much focus and really realizing all of our demands. I think that it's something that will happen gradually, and I think it's important to have one big point of focus after another and keep having those successes, as is seen in the Middle East right now. The protests in Tunisia and Egypt didn't end when Ben Ali fled and when Mubarak fled, but it keeps continuing. They're organizing, they're protesting, they're demonstrating until they're really figuring out each demand and realizing it as it comes, and I hope that that happens here.
Well, let me turn back to you, Max. I understand you have to leave. What's your take on what she just said? How likely is that to perhaps play in the same way that the revolutions have played out in Tunisia? She talked about in Egypt. We know that they were not revolutions that had defined leadership initially.
The goal was simple, a regime change, and they succeeded in toppling the regimes, and now they're continuing to build on that strength. So you need to have a success story to build on by simply saying, well, we have a lot of things we're against, and we're against feeling bad, and that's what we're against. And without having a specific goal, you're going to lose before you start. And this is what's going to happen with Occupy Wall Street. And I think what's interesting, just as a side note, with the Arab Spring revolution, we had this fantastic contingency event happen, which is that the entire Israeli narrative in the region that the Muslims were bad and the Israelis were good was destroyed, and now you have this huge uprising in Israel. Because now there's been an opening in the media space to allow the Israelis to step forward and say, wait a minute, our country, Israel, enormously corrupt. We need a regime change in Israel.
Okay,
so
well, let me switch over. Let me switch back
that are really on the front line.
All right, let me switch back to Carol Gould now in London. How do you see all of this at this point in time as frustration continues to rise in the United States? Of course, we have an increase as far as the loss of job, loss of homes, and loss of the middle class. How likely is it that you think the United States will be witnessing soon in mass demonstrations?
Well, I wanted to agree with Max on a point he made at the beginning of the program, which is that much as I don't want to see Wall Street brought down, I don't want to see banks destroyed, I believe that we do need an infrastructure, and that is how a good, strong society succeeds. Otherwise, you end up with communism or Nazism or fascism. But Max made a point that if food stamps are eliminated, and I would add Medicare, we're going to have old people on the street, we're going to have middle-class Americans on the street, and that will be a problem. I also would like to say that, and perhaps I'm being devil's advocate here, because I don't agree with what was going on in Wall Street this weekend and last week. I don't think it's the way to make a point. I believe being part of the political process is the way to make a point, that the Tea Party movement, which began about 2 years ago and which had a huge march on Washington, has actually managed to turn Congress around. So you now have a Republican Congress. They have managed through tireless work across the United States to bring in candidates who then won. They kicked out Democrats. There are several Tea Party senators. There was actually a Tea Party debate sponsored by CNN. It was actually called the Tea Party Express Evening.
Well, let me just jump in here, Carol. You said that through the political
this is a very disparate movement.
Carol, you said then through the political process that there have been changes, for example, with the Tea Party. How much change has really taken place, though? Okay, so at one point we have a dominated Democratic Party, for example, leading the Congress, and then we have a Republican one. But what has really changed as far as in politics in the United States? And do you think that it is unfair to say that a lot of these young people that are taking to the streets in New York have become totally frustrated with the political system in the United States?
Well, perhaps they have, but they have to take a lesson from the success of the Republican and the right wing and the Tea Party movement. If they want to be successful, they have to have a very well organized movement. They have to raise money, and I hate to say it, but there are probably a few people in the establishment business world who might support a movement for change to increase the number of people who have health care, to keep Medicare, to keep food stamps. I mean, look at George Soros. He's one of the richest men in the world, but you would probably put him in the political left. He certainly isn't pro-Israel. He's not pro-Zionist. And Barbara Streisand, many of the richest people in America are very much to the left and liberal. So this movement needs to go to established people whom they may not like for one reason or another, but if they want some help, then they need to get their financial support and their organizational support, perhaps a headquarters. And again, I'm being devil's advocate. I don't want to see revolution in the U.S., but if they do want to get their point across through the political system, they need to get help from established people.
All right, let me turn to Ms. Miller. Now, Anna Miller, what about that? Do you think that you can find the changes or get the changes that you're seeking through the political process?
No, I don't think that we can. I think that there was a time that you could, speaking of FDR, but right now you can't because there has been a corporate takeover of politics. You have something called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, where corporations literally will pay huge sums of money to get together with politicians, draft model legislation that is then put across the United States through state legislation, which is easier to pass than federal legislation. You see many right-wing type things that include the lack of regulation of labor, union-busting bills, the lack of regulation of environmental protections, many other things that make it much easier for corporations to turn profits, which they then proceed to use for their own good rather than the greater good because they're not paying taxes. So many, such as GE, Bank of America, aren't paying taxes to the federal government, which is then in turn going to not fund our social safety net. And then we're getting benefits slashed right and left. Medicare, Medicaid have been on the budget table with the threat of no longer servicing Americans. And that's why people are in the streets now, is because corporations run America, not politicians. Politicians are the puppets of corporations.
Do you think, Ms. Miller, what you've just described, what you just said, do you think that the average person on the street that has that is participating in this sit-in at Wall Street, do you think that they feel the same way? Do they have the understanding, according to what you're saying, of what is going on in the United States? Basically, what Max Keiser said earlier, that in general, perhaps they have not actually defined the main problems, or do you think they have a very good grip on what's going on?
I think many of them either have a grip politically on what's going on with the interactions between corporations and politicians. I think the vast majority have simply felt the effects themselves, and that's what's pushing them into the streets.
Now, Carol Gould, you said that you do not support revolution in the United States. As the economic situation becomes more and more grave, do you think that you're likely to witness more people taking to the street, more people basically feeling that they have no choice but to take to the streets, or no? Do you think that most Americans will just stick with the basically political system and try to make the changes from within?
Well, there was a poll recently, it was last week, that showed that Americans have about 23% confidence in the Congress and the Senate. Now, that's pretty scary, because that means that almost 80% of Americans have no regard for the political system. And as I said before, if you really become, if there is a revolution and you have unrest everywhere, you risk the rise of communism or fascism or Nazism or some extreme movement. I think that many Americans do have grievances. And as I said before, the Tea Party movement, the right wing of the Republican Party, the evangelical movement, have grievances about the power of federal government. What has just been discussed is the power of corporations. But again, as I said before, you have to have some structure to keep a country going. We have to have corporations. You have to have banks. You have to have Wall Street. But as I also mentioned before,
but let me just jump in. But if you have these things, if you have the corporations, Carol, if you have the corporations, if you have the banks, is there a way that they could be redefined? Because many demonstrators are saying that they do not represent the interests of the average American.
Yes, because as I was about to say, the problem that we have is a president who seems to be completely moribund. The left and the liberals, and even some Republicans. After all, Susan Eisenhower was chairman of Republicans for Obama. Julie Nixon was co-chairman of Republicans for Obama. People thought that he really was going to bring America out of the mess it was in when Bush left office, when we had financial meltdown, when Barack Obama was elected. We were nearing world financial meltdown. And the problem with Obama is that over the past 2 years, he has done virtually nothing himself to change the way things are structured. And Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, did. He literally just said, we are going to do this. It may have seemed dictatorial, but it was a presidential edict. He said, we have to do A, B, C, and D. We're going to create the New Deal. We're going to create TVA. We're going to create the Works Progress Association. He put people back to work. He rebuilt the country. And then America was ready to help Britain during World War II and help Europe. We wouldn't have been ready for World War II without Roosevelt. And he also stopped America from the big movement. There was a big Nazi movement in America. He stopped a big communist movement that was rising up in America. Simply through the power of his personality, he was able to get Republicans to agree to his programs, which I'm afraid Barack Obama doesn't have. And those people who were on the right or Republican and who wanted to give Obama a bit of a chance feel that he's terribly disappointing, and I'm sure the left is deeply disappointed in Obama.
Well, Anna Miller, I'm almost out of time.
You have got to...
Let me get Ms. Miller back in on this. I was reading an interesting quote by German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, which says that none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe that they are free. Do you think that this perhaps is an appropriate quote to describe the current situation inside of the United States or not?
I think it is a very appropriate quote to describe the current situation inside the United States, and it is the idea that has spurred Occupy Wall Street, is people waking up literally and realizing that they aren't free, that it's not a free country, that it's not a democracy, and wanting to change that.
Okay. And on that note, I would like to thank all my guests for this program. From London, Carol Gould, author and political commentator. From Paris, financial journalist and broadcaster Max Keiser. And from New York, journalist and activist Anna Miller. Thank you all for being with us. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you tuning in to us, and join us same place, same time as tomorrow. We take another look at one of tomorrow's top headline stories. Well, I'm Marzieh Hashemi. For myself and all the crew here in Tehran, thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.